Acts chapter 17, starting at verse 22. So Paul, standing in the midst of the Areopagus, said, "Men of Athens, I perceive that in every way you are very religious. For as I passed along and observed the objects of your worship, I found also an altar with this inscription, 'To the unknown God.' What therefore you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by man, nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives all mankind life and breath and everything. And he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling place, that they should seek God and perhaps feel their way toward him and find him. Yet he is actually not far from each one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being, as even some of your own poets have said, for we are indeed his offspring. Being then God's offspring, we ought not to think that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone, an image formed by the art and imagination of man. The times of ignorance God overlooked, but now he commands all people everywhere to repent, because he has fixed a day on which he will judge the world in righteousness by a man whom he has appointed. And of this he has given assurance to all by raising him from the dead." Now when they heard of the resurrection of the dead, some mocked. But others said, "We will hear you again about this." So Paul went out from their midst, but some men joined him and believed, among whom also were Dionysius the Areopagite and a woman named Damaris, and others with them. Just as paganism was the dominant worldview when Paul ministered there 2,000 years ago, atheistic secularism is the dominant worldview in Europe today. So like Paul, we have to engage with it if we're going to live out our faith and if we're going to share our faith. And by the way, when I say atheistic secularism is the dominant worldview, I don't mean in terms of adherence. There are very few committed atheistic secularists. Most people in this country believe in the supernatural in some form or another, so that rules them out as proper card-carrying atheists. But the assumptions that dictate public life, and in which I include education and the media and the world of work, they're dominated, heavily influenced by atheism and secularism. So I'm going to make a few observations on atheistic secularism as a worldview, and then I'm going to conclude by attempting briefly to draw out some lessons from the way Paul engaged with the leading thinkers of Athens to help us as we engage with those around us who, whether they know it or not, have been thoroughly catechized in the beliefs of atheistic secularism. I've chosen to be specific about atheistic secularism because, believe it or not, I'm on good terms with the current president of the National Secular Society. And he would say that you can be a non-atheistic secularist. In practice, of course, most secularists appear to be atheists, and the outworking of the worldview is always atheistic, by definition, because of its exclusion of the divine. But if Keith ever hears this talk, I want him to know that I've tried to be fair to his worldview by being specific. But he and you will have to forgive me if I use atheism and secularism as synonyms during this talk for the purposes of brevity. One of the reasons atheistic secularism dominates the Western mind, even though most Westerners consider themselves religious or spiritual in some way, is because it's a political model. It's not just a private belief system with political outworkings. Politics is central. Christians sometimes get accused of exerting excessive political influence and wanting to establish a theocracy and forcing their religion on other people and all that rubbish. The truth is that the Christian faith is not primarily a political worldview. It certainly has political ramifications. I've spent the last 25 years working at the Christian Institute precisely because I believe passionately that Christians do have something to say about politics and public square issues. I think there's so much more that Christians could be doing, so much more to rehabilitate the moral truths of the Christian faith and argue for the goodness of God's law. We live in a democracy, so believers are just as entitled as anyone else to try and influence the shape of that democracy. But the slogan of the Christian Institute is Christian influence in a secular world. It's not Christianizing the world. It's not taking Britain back for Jesus. Ours is a limited goal. We want believers to take up the opportunities afforded by living in a democracy that owes a great deal to Christian thinkers, to take up the opportunities to contribute to the common good, to testify to the obvious moral truths of Scripture, its principles of justice, and to try to persuade our fellow citizens, our elected representatives, to support good laws and oppose bad ones. There's so much more I could say about how Christians have done this over the centuries around the world, playing a central role in the development of education and healthcare and child protection and so much more. In this country, the Christian Institute and its supporters have been used by God to prevent numerous bad laws making it onto the statute books and to secure some good laws too, laws that protect the very existence of churches and Christian organizations here, and laws that protect the freedom of believers to talk about their faith. Perhaps I might get an invitation to come back someday and talk about these other examples, but my point for today's talk is that Christians don't think we're going to make the world perfect. Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world." He told us to render to God what is God's and to Caesar what is Caesar's. And we know that there will be a new heavens and a new earth. This world and this life is not all there is. So there is a limit to our expectations for now in this life. We know that until Christ returns, there is an ongoing cosmic conflict between good and evil, and this means we accept the existence of other worldviews. And we try to engage respectfully with the people who hold those views. We don't believe we're going to take over every institution. We respect the freedom of those with other beliefs, even though we disagree with them. We accept their freedom to do the same as us, to make their case in the public square, to uphold their beliefs in their families and their institutions. And more than that, we pray for the prosperity of individuals and institutions and cities and nations that are not based on the Christian faith. Because that's what the Jews in exile were commanded to do in Jeremiah 29:7. And in Romans 13 and 1 Peter 2, the apostles commanded churches living under a persecuting pagan regime to pray for and even honor the emperor and all those in authority. What Paul and Peter say is that non-Christian institutions are still used by God to do good. That's what the wording says, to do good, up to and including helping secure freedom for the spread of the gospel. Read Romans 13, that's what it says. So we don't have a worldview that our job as churches is to take over every institution and silence every voice that we disagree with. We're tolerant. Whereas secularism can't abide the influence on affairs of state of any worldview other than their own. Secularists believe this world is all there is. And so all their hopes are set on remaking it. And they hold that everything must be secularized, that religion must be expunged from the law, from education, from politics. I just want to make a brief point about the word secular, which of course just means temporal as opposed to spiritual. It's things to do with this life as opposed to things to do with the next life. It doesn't mean evil. As with so many words, it's when you put the ism on the end that you get the problems. So most Christians engage in secular employments. That doesn't make them wrong or worthless. On the contrary, the Apostle Paul tells us, whatever you do, do all to the glory of God. So you can do secular things to the glory of God. And it's a pity that the word has been hijacked so that secular and secularism are treated as the same thing. So I'm arguing that secularist intolerance of other beliefs in the public square means they want religion out of politics, out of education, out of healthcare. The National Secular Society website says it believes in, quote, separation of religious institutions from state institutions and a public sphere where religion may participate but not dominate. Well, that sounds fair enough. But a few paragraphs later, they say that secularism ensures religious groups don't interfere in affairs of state. They just said religion could participate in the public sphere, but now they don't seem so sure. And then look at what they actually campaign for. They say all state-funded schools should be non-religious in character. They actually have a campaign website called No More Faith Schools. Imagine if we campaigned for no more non-Christian schools. We'd be pilloried for being intolerant. The National Secular Society also says this: when a public body grants a contract for the provision of services to an organization affiliated to a particular religion or belief, such services must be delivered neutrally with no attempt to promote the ideas of that faith group. Well, again, this is just privileging secularist ideas, insulating them from competition or critique. A truly tolerant public square can cope with a few Christian organizations providing services funded by the state at the same time as, probably with their own money, promoting their faith. Lots of agencies promote ideas alongside their services, and the idea that anything is neutral, that word delivering services neutrally, I mean, that's a con. Nothing is neutral. Everyone promotes ideas, and you can't move in the public sector these days for rainbow flags celebrating LGBT ideology. And the National Secular Society are very happy about that. So they are happy for some ideas to be promoted in the provision of services, and quite happy for the taxpayer to pay for it. At least we believe in funding our own evangelism. So secularism is not neutral. It's a belief system and an ideology of its own. Promote it if you like, but at least be honest about what you're doing. Don't pretend that it's neutral. Everyone promotes their ideas. It's not a question of whether ideas will be promoted. It's just a question of which ideas. And we have to remember this. If you think that your friends or the BBC and ITV or the government or the UN, if you think that they are neutral, then you are going to get confused and in fact compromised about what you believe. Whereas if you recognize that they are promoting a particular set of values, you can engage with them much more wisely. And you can have more confidence to offer an alternative Christian view. So how many atheistic secularists are there? Well, the census data for 2001 recorded 15% of people ticking the no religion box and 72% ticking Christian. By the 2011 census, those ticking no religion had increased by 10% to 25%, and those identifying as Christian had fallen to 59%. We don't yet have the 2021 data, so we'll have to see what that shows. Now, Humanists UK, which is another atheist group, they encourage their members to tick no religion at the 2011 census, and they made great play about the increase in the figures. And in fact, by breaking down all the religions into their separate denominations, some of the atheists even tried to claim that the results showed that they are the largest single group in Britain today, as if they're a monolithic group of people with identical beliefs. But the truth is, most of the people who select no religion are not the kind of people who would be welcome to join Humanists UK or the National Secular Society. In fact, just like most of those who tick Christian don't go to church or hold to Christian teachings, most of those who tick no religion don't have a personal belief in atheism. Sociologists call this group the nones, and they spend a lot of effort describing how they are often not irreligious. I've actually met Bible-believing Christians who would tick the no religion box, because they think the word religion means a man-made system of trying to earn your way to God. It's a funny idea, but that's what they think. And in fact, the census of 2011 allowed people to indicate specifically if they were atheists and humanists. Do you want to know the figures? 29,267 declared themselves to be atheists. An additional 15,000 identified as humanists. Even adding together agnostics, secularists, free thinkers, only gives a grand total of less than 78,000 people, or 0.14% of the population. By contrast, the census found there were 33 million people who identified as Christian. Clearly, they are not in church every Sunday, if only they were. Census statistics are not the same as the Lamb's Book of Life, but the census does show just how few see atheistic secularism as their personal belief system. Yet vast multitudes in our society are influenced by the application of atheistic ideas to all areas of public life. What the atheists lack in number, they certainly make up for in terms of influence and boldness. And that should be a challenge to us. So how do we square up the fact that few in our nation actually hold this worldview as a personal belief system, while so many assume that it's the right way to engage in the public square? Well, there are two helpful concepts provided by Charles Taylor, whose book, A Secular Age, seems to be the key text on how today's secularism developed. Carl Trueman also uses these concepts in his important book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. Now, I should say, I've read Trueman cover to cover. I haven't read Taylor. But the first concept is what Taylor apparently calls the social imaginary. And this is, he says, the way that we collectively imagine our social life in the contemporary Western world. And he says the way we think about our place in the world often comes from cultural influences, not abstract theory. So our society's view on how to live publicly is shaped more by images and stories and popular culture, and much less by theoretical philosophy or theology. People generally won't have spent long thinking through public life in theoretical terms, so they can land on a position on a particular issue that may not match their broader worldview. It's so important for us as Christians to think in a Christian way about our engagement in the public square, so we don't fall into that trap. I'm going to say our website, christian.org.uk, has lots of resources to help you with this. And I'd also strongly recommend the writings of my colleague, Dr. Sharon James, especially her latest book, The Lies We Are Told, The Truth We Must Hold. Well, the second observation I'm borrowing from Taylor is the shift that's occurred from the era when religious belief was universally assumed to today's world in which religious belief often feels out of place. Now, we're not looking at how that shift has happened. You'll have to read Truman or Taylor for that. But they both explain how in the West, people previously understood authority in a vertical sense. God giving authority to kings and rulers. God setting out the laws of nature. God establishing right from wrong. Whereas today, people think of authority in horizontal terms. We give the authority to those who govern us. We democratically establish laws. And we decide for ourselves what is right or wrong. Now, I'm not attacking democracy. I agree with Churchill that democracy is the worst form of government except for all those other forms that have been tried. Democracy is a very good safeguard against dictators, and it gives everyone, including Christians, opportunity to influence things. But the question over who decides right and wrong sets the thinking Christian on a very different course from the rest of society. Even if someone does believe in the supernatural or they're nominally Christian, when they don't see morality as deriving from God's rule, they buy into the secularists' way of thinking. So what is it that drives secularist ideology? And this is key to my argument. Can we find any common ground? Well, Taylor observes that discussion about atheism often becomes a discussion of metaphysical questions, arguments for and against the existence of God. Now, this classical approach to apologetics, declaring the existence of God to be in accordance with our natural knowledge and sense of divinity, this has always been an important part of the church's witness, as we read in Acts 17. And we see it again in Romans 1 and 2, where Paul says God's moral law is written on every person's heart. And so conscience can prompt people to know and to do the right thing, even though they don't know God. It says that we suppress this knowledge of God and his law, but it is there. Christians get asked to justify why they believe in God, but Taylor, I think, turns the question around and asks, why would a person pursue an atheist approach to life? I think this is probably a useful evangelistic tool, but asking these questions can also help to reveal the things that we have in common. They help to demonstrate and show up the knowledge and the longing that is common to believers and unbelievers alike. So Taylor suggests that the believer and unbeliever are united by a common desire for what he calls fullness. This is what he says. The unbeliever wants to be the kind of person for whom this life is fully satisfying, in which all of him can rejoice, in which his whole sense of fullness can find an adequate object. The problem, of course, is that they're only looking for the answer within themselves. Taylor's not alone in identifying a common pursuit of fullness. That idea runs throughout C.S. Lewis's autobiographical work, Surprised by Joy. Lewis explains that his own spiritual journey was driven by an attempt to understand that sense of what he calls inconsolable longing. And his journey, it took him through an attachment to the literature of the Romanticism movement and eventually to his Christian conversion. Because there is a God, even though many deny his existence, deny his rule, there will always be a need to explain this sense of longing. Augustine famously wrote in his Confessions, "You have made us for yourself, O Lord, and our heart is restless until it rests in you." We shouldn't let atheists off the hook about this longing and about how it shows that they are hiding from the truth that there is a God. In Book 1, Chapter 2 of his Institutes, Calvin is clear that from the course of nature we can, quote, perceive that God, our Maker, supports us by his power, rules us by his providence, fosters us by his goodness, and visits us with all kinds of blessings. This is obviously, I stress the point, it's not saving knowledge, it's not true worship, but it's nonetheless real. In Acts 14, during Paul's appeal to the pagans at Lystra, he says that although in past generations God allowed all the nations to walk in their own ways, yet he did not leave himself without witness, for he did good by giving you rains from heaven and fruitful seasons, satisfying your hearts with food and gladness. Now, as an aside, I think we can sometimes find it difficult to believe that God satisfies the hearts of unbelievers with gladness. And I think that's because we have an underdeveloped theology of the common grace of God and a limited understanding of the kindness and the goodness of God. And we say we believe in the sovereignty and the providence of God in all things, but we somehow find it difficult to believe that God is actively at work in and through everything we see around us, including our own mundane daily labors. 2 Corinthians 9 says that God supplies seed to the sower and bread for food. We might find it easy to believe he makes the crops grow, but Paul tells the Corinthian church that God's also actively involved in the activity of bakers. He supplies bread. Bread doesn't grow out the ground. Bread needs the skill of a baker. It needs a combination of multiple ingredients. It's got to be baked in an oven. God is actively at work positively in all of that, including in providing ovens. This gives great value and dignity to the world of work and our ordinary everyday lives. God is actively helping you and working through you, whether you are cooking or accounting or cleaning or talking or healing or writing or buying or selling. And this is why we're commanded that whatever you do, do all to the glory of God. So we said that God is the source of all the good things that people enjoy. And as Paul stresses, this acknowledgement of God should lead to worship, but sadly, of course, it usually doesn't. As Calvert puts it, though experience testifies that a seed of religion is divinely sown in all, scarcely 1 in 100 is found who cherishes it in his heart. His stats are pretty good. In England, around 2.3% of the population attend an evangelical church. Reformed or conservative evangelicals make up around half that number. Estimates for 2020 are that there were 1.28 million evangelicals in England out of a total population of 56 million. For the great majority of us, instead of directing worship to God, we worship other things. As Calvin's famous maxim goes, our hearts are factories of idols. So the knowledge of God is present, but misdirected in every human being, including in the avowed atheist. And we see how this goes wrong in the way atheists exalt human reason. Take the example of the German philosopher Immanuel Kant, whose emphasis on the autonomy of reason led him to see reason as the ultimate lawgiver. He said morality should not be imposed or directed by external powers, whether politicians or pastors. Instead of being obedient to externally imposed law or religious precept, he said each person should be obedient to their own self-imposed law. It sounds like anarchy to me, and it also sounds like the way a lot of people live today. I once took part in a debate in Conway Hall in London, which is one of the few buildings in the UK owned and run explicitly to promote secular humanism. In the main hall, painted in big letters above the stage, like a Bible verse, are the words, "To thine own self be true." And the 16th century English seems calculated to invoke the authority of the King James Bible. It doesn't give the citation. Anyone know the source of the quote? Shakespeare. It's words that William Shakespeare puts in the mouth of Polonius, a character in Hamlet. And here's the Wikipedia. Colin will shout at me for quoting Wikipedia for anything. Here's the Wikipedia description of Polonius. Polonius is the chief counselor of the play's ultimate villain, Claudius, generally regarded as wrong in every judgment he makes over the course of the play. It's bad enough making the words of a playwright the basis for your life. But to rely on a line from one of Shakespeare's fools is both a comedy and a tragedy all of its own. In all this emphasis on autonomy, on defining our own morality regardless of what the Bible says, there's a failure to recognize that the total depravity of man means that his reason itself is fallen and not really autonomous, because it's bound to sinful human nature. And so, as the apostle says in Romans 1, claiming to be wise, they became fools. But what we can see in "To thine own self be true" is that taking the atheistic secularist's stance, a self-derived morality, doesn't necessarily mean becoming hyper-rationalist. Indeed, maybe the predominant form in our current day is what the philosopher Alistair MacIntyre apparently calls the expressive individual who grants his own personal preferences the status of universal moral imperatives. And this view says that pure reason does not account for the experience of our emotions or intuition, so it elevates emotion, and I think it can become increasingly irrational. I think it's pretty obvious we live in a society where people carry out their moral reasoning on the basis of emotional and aesthetic preferences. Carl Trueman links it to the rise of the transgender movement, and that's obvious. The idea that you are what you feel and that fullness is to be found in living an authentic life in tune with your feelings leads a lot of people to reject the natural order of things, even the most basic and obvious reality that a man cannot become a woman, and vice versa. So I said that atheistic secularism is not a neutral position, nor is it simply life minus religion. It's an active search for fulfillment by human-centered and godless means. And many follow its ideology and values without giving it a second thought, simply because they've absorbed it from the surrounding culture. We can contrast this to the evangelical and reform worldview, which is theocentric. Man's chief end is to glorify God and to enjoy him forever. And God established the natural order for our benefit, and our response is to flourish under it to fulfill God's plan. Well, I hope I said that I wanted to come back to the claims of the atheistic secularist groups again. And I want to quote now a previous president of the National Secular Society, Terry Sanderson. And this is what he wrote to his supporters. I would like us to position ourselves as a purely secularist organization with a focused objective that will not only champion human rights above religious demands, but will also accept that religion has a place in society for those who want it, but on terms of equality, not privilege. There's a tacit admission there that some of those who champion secularism do not accept that religion has any place in society, even for those who want it. He's apparently fighting against the more intolerant wing of his own party. Humanists UK used to have this statement of purpose in their trust deed registered with the Charity Commission. This is what it said. It talked about the mental and moral improvement of the human race by means of the advancement of humanism. That is to say, the moral and social development of the community free from theistic or dogmatic beliefs and doctrines. They were actively campaigning for the community and the human race to be free of theistic doctrines. Can you imagine trying to register a Christian charity for a society free of non-Christian beliefs and doctrines? We're against the idea of trying to force everyone in society to say they believe what we believe, not least because it creates compromised churches full of unbelievers, whereas God wants us to worship him in spirit and in truth. The most repressive regimes of the 20th and 21st century have had this kind of impulse to wipe out other beliefs, China, the largest nation on earth, is a totalitarian, atheistic regime that brutally represses all religious beliefs, including Christianity. It permits only a state-approved, nationalistic, idolatrous version of the faith in the form of the Three Self-Patriotic Movement Church, where you now have to put up pictures of Chairman Mao in your church and declare obeisance to the Chinese Communist Party. Look around the world for people trying to put this atheistic secularism into practice, and what do you see? Intolerance and repression. We see immigrants fleeing this repression. And where are they fleeing to? Countries with a Christian heritage where there's freedom. I think that tells you a lot. But the second revealing thing about Terry Sanderson's statement is the sleight of hand, where in one breath he claims to be permitting religious freedom on terms of equality, but in the next he's making clear that he wants to put human rights above religious demands. He's clever about his terms, because he's replaced the idea of religious rights with religious demands. He's glossed over the fact that human rights law protects religion. The right to freedom of religion or belief, the right to manifest your beliefs in worship, practice, and observance, free from state interference, are rights protected in the European Convention on Human Rights, the UN Declaration of Human Rights, and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. But if you reduce religious rights to demands, it makes them sound harsh and unreasonable, and you can justify overriding them. So Terry's just putting his own secular beliefs above all religions. It's a power grab. It's worth noting the kind of campaigns which atheistic secularists tend to embrace are often pretty obvious attacks on Christian morality. Many now see LGBT rights as so superior to religion that they want a conversion therapy law to ban Christians from trying to encourage same-sex attracted and transgender people from embracing the Christian faith. The humanists wrote to the government saying that a conversion therapy ban should explicitly cover repentance. They used that word. They're also often passionate in support of abortion and euthanasia. Not exclusively, there are honorable exceptions, but often that's where atheism takes you. And I think there's a close association between atheism and a lowered view of the value of human life. Because a godless understanding of creation says that man is no different from any other creature. But, and here's one of my key points, which I hope I've already hinted at, they're not wrong about everything. They're made in the image of God, with God's moral laws written on their hearts. And this comes out in what they say and do. So they can be instruments of God's common grace in their vocation. If pagan emperors could be used for good, then so can atheists. During the early 2000s, I started forging a working relationship and subsequently a friendship with Keith Porteous Wood, who was at that time the director of the National Secular Society. The issue we worked on together was freedom of speech. We each wanted to protect our own freedom of speech and were prepared to protect one another's freedom of speech too. I always joked that I was prepared to defend Keith's freedom to be wrong in order to defend my own freedom to be right. But it's closer to the truth to say that protecting free speech for everybody is protecting everybody's freedom to hear the truth. I wasn't always a Christian. I've had the experience of hearing beliefs that I despised and rejected at first, but then I accepted later. I changed my mind. I repented. If there'd been no freedom of speech for those ideas, I would never have had the chance. And as a believer, today I'm still learning, hopefully, and growing and being renewed in my mind and transformed by the Spirit. As a sinner, I know I get things wrong. I know I'm meant to be humble. I'm meant to be willing to learn. So I'm arguing that I have to protect other people's freedom to say things I don't agree with, because sometimes they'll turn out to be right. Working with Keith was a successful partnership. We ran 2 campaigns together that led to government defeats in Parliament and legislative changes that protected free speech for everyone. Keith was friendly and generous to me, and I'll always be grateful for that. Whenever I would introduce Keith to a Christian friend, he would joke. He'd say, "You can't see my horns," as if we all thought he was the devil. But actually, despite all our differences, we had a much higher opinion of him than that. And this brings me to my conclusion and back to Acts 17. The Apostle Paul doesn't start his message to the pagans just by denouncing them. He actually finds common ground instead. He says, "I see you are very religious." Now, someone will point out that the Greek word can mean superstitious, and we use superstitious in a pejorative way. I don't think that's the tone of what Paul is saying. Because although he very definitely is challenging them, he says God does not live in temples, he's also finding points of connection with them. He's identifying areas of common ground. He's quoting their own altar inscription. He's quoting their own philosophers and poets, Epimenides probably, and Aratus. He's emphasizing shared understandings and things that all of us can observe from creation. He's saying that all of us are descended from one man and that we are all God's offspring. He's explaining God's offer of salvation to all, and is even saying that God is actually not far from each one of us. Paul speaks to thinkers as a thinker. He speaks in Greek to Greeks. He speaks to pagans about their own worship in a way that's informed and respectful, while still being faithful to critique it and to warn them. He doesn't just stand up and say, "You're an horrible bunch of pagans and you're all going to hell," and then walk away. So in our dealings with atheists and secularists, I think we'd do well to follow Paul by seeking to understand where they're coming from, by reading their literature, listening to their podcasts, so we can identify where they're wrong and where they are sometimes right. We should find common ground, recognizing that they're seeking some of the same things we are seeking: contentment, security, relationships. We should remember that their consciences within them are testifying to basic realities about God and about right and wrong. So when we tell them the truth, we can afford to be gentle, because the chances are that their conscience is amplifying what we're saying. If you've ever wondered why LGBT activists get so angry when we say that same-sex activity is sinful, however mildly we say it, I think it's because our words are provoking their consciences, and their consciences are on our side of the debate. And so they have to try harder to suppress the witness of their own consciences by shouting at us or whatever. When Romans 1 talks about suppressing the truth in unrighteousness, it's a universal human trait. We've all done it. So we should sympathize with those who can't bear to have their sins called out, at the same time as we know that the most loving thing to do is to tell the truth at the right time, in the right place, in the right way, speaking the truth in love, as Ephesians 4 says, remembering that gentleness is a fruit of the Spirit. The reaction to Paul's remarks at the Areopagus is mixed. Acts 17 says, "Now when they heard of the resurrection of the dead, some mocked. But others said, 'We will hear you again about this.' So Paul went out from their midst, but some men joined him and believed, among whom also were Dionysius the Areopagite and a woman named Damaris, and others with them." Some mocked, some wanted to hear more, some believed, including a leading figure there at the Areopagus itself. So I'm saying, like Paul with the pagans, we have to find ways of connecting to those whose worldview is shaped by atheistic secularism. We'll never persuade everybody. Even when we try to be reasonable and respectful and find common ground, we have to expect that some will mock, or worse. We have to be prepared to follow up and keep talking with those who are unsure and who want to hear more. And by the work of the Spirit, some will come to believe in the God who made them.